Mr. William Dangro was born on October 8, 1932 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Mr. Dangro had 11 siblings, 10 sisters, and 1 brother. His mother was a housewife and his father worked for the government. As a child, Mr. Dangro had to pull down his window shades and participate in air drills because of World War II. Before he entered the service, he was just playing around. Mr. Dangro enlisted in the Army on September 1, 1950. He chose to join the Army because he knew he did not want to be in the Navy.
Well, because I figured I could walk faster further than I could swim. So I didn't want the Navy.
He did not want to be in the Navy. Before he headed off to Korea, Mr. Dangro went to a training camp. In training camp, he learned how to fight under combat conditions, hand-to-hand combat, and what military life would be like. He had a very good military life with the U.S., but unfortunately, he did not have a lot of time with the U.S. military. After training, Mr. Dangro was sent to Japan for occupations duty. He then traveled by boat and made an amphibious landing on Korea. The boat had to travel from Japan to Korea in a typhoon, which was one of the worst typhoons they've ever had. On this boat, Mr. Dangro and his fellow soldiers had to be tied to their beds so they would stay there. After the travel through rough waters that wiped everything off the boats, Mr. Dangro was finally in Korea. The war got started when the North Koreans invaded South Korea in June of 1950. The Americans were sent to Korea in July 1950, but Mr. Dangro only got there in September. In Korea, Mr. Dangro was in the Battle of Encheon, Battle of the Suwon, and the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. These battles were some of the worst in history because of the extreme cold and hand-to-hand combat. In these battles, Mr. Dangro worked as an agent for artillery. His job was to run back and forth between regimental to the lines and pass codes to the colonel. Mr. Dangro was wounded 4 times in battle, but the cold affected him more than his wounds. The nerves in his legs were destroyed from being frostbitten. He was shot in the knee 3 times, 2 bullets went through and 1 stayed in. Mr. Dangro walked around Korea for half a year with that bullet in his knee before he removed it with scissors. He also got a mortar round in the back that put him in a wheelchair. Along with these injuries, Mr. Dangro also has spinal stenosis. When enlisting in the Army, Mr. Dangro never considered being captured as a prisoner of war. He is planning on making a career out of being in the Army. However, his plans changed on December 1, 1950, when he was taken in as a prisoner of war for the North Koreans. Before arriving at camp, the prisoners went on a 6-month death march. They walked all over North Korea and Manchuria, China. The purpose of this march was to build up the North Koreans' morale after losing. The POWs marched sun up to sundown every day for 6 months.
The POWs arrived at the camps sometime in May 1951. The conditions of the camps were miserable. Mr. Dangro slept on the floor, and the only heat he had was the heat from the other side of the camp, where the kitchen was. The food available to him was dog meat, rats, weasels, maggots, and anything else he could find to eat. Many people died during this time. Some of the prisoners even made friends with the guards, including Mr. Dangro himself. Even though the POW camps were awful, Mr. Dangro and most of the other prisoners tried to make their time enjoyable. Some of the POWs played soccer with the guards. While Mr. Dangro was away at war, his parents received 3 death certificates. The first death certificate said he was killed on December 3rd. The second said he was killed on December 6th, and the third death certificate said he died in a prison camp. The death certificates were from General MacArthur, President Truman, and General Page. Along with these death certificates, Mr. Dangro's parents received the folded flag and the Great Purple Hearts. Mr. Dangro received a good selection of awards. He received 4 Purple Hearts, 9 Battle Stars, and 5 Beachhead Stars, which are all on the same ribbon. Mr. Dangro was not expecting to make it out of the POW camps. However, on October 7th, 1953, he was sent home.
Well, I can tell you it was hell. I weighed 185 pounds when I left the house in June of 1950, or before that. And when I got home, I weighed 116. My mom didn't know me. My dad died while I was in a prison camp. And she wouldn't let the Red Cross notify me. I probably would have gave up.
Mr. Dangro got home on a Friday, and despite everything he went through in Korea, he returned to work that Monday. After getting back from Korea, Mr. Dangro started his own business. He enjoyed this because he did not have a boss, because he was his own boss. Mr. Dangro got married and has now been married for 65 years. At home, he began to eat whatever he wanted, and he did not care how unhealthy it was, because of the food he was forced to eat in the POW camps. Mr. Dangro now is a part of the VA and is honored every day for his service. He is a part of the American Legion, VFW, AM Vets, Purple Hearts, Wounded Warriors, and the Disabled Veterans. Mr. Dangro said that the military made him a better person. If asked to go back to Korea, he would pick up a gun and go, but this time with more ammunition. His advice to teenagers is to make the best out of high school, because it is the best years of your life. Thank you, Mr. Dangro, for your service in protecting our country.